Welcome back. This particular lecture is something of a review and preview. One of the great debates and challenges that occurred during the early centuries of the church was the Trinitarian and Christological debates. They actually came to a head and occupied the discussion theologically for about a century in the 4th century. But some of the issues had been developing among some of the men that we've already looked at, some of the theologians we've already considered. So we're going to take a quick, I hope it's quick, review of some of that and then preview where these debates are going to be going into the 4th century. So without further ado, because this is, I hope, not too long of a lecture, let me go ahead and let's start looking at the Trinitarian debates at preview. The so-called era of the Trinitarian debates begins with the conversion of Constantine. It's a very complicated and very dramatic story. By all accounts, one of the major turning points in the history of the church was Constantine's conversion to Christianity. Who was Constantine? Constantine was the first Christian emperor. He began his reign in 306 after a series of internal struggles. He consolidated his rule over the entire Roman Empire in 324. In addition to his successful military campaigns, Constantine made several administrative changes that established and extended his influence. It's also very complicated politically. Complicated in this sense. In 305, the previous emperors, yes, there were 2 of them at the time, had abdicated, and this led to a civil war. At a crucial battle at the Malvian Bridge near Rome, and just as a footnote here, everybody should know this as just a simple historical fact. Constantine saw a sign in the sky, a vision. This is related by the church historian Eusebius, who wrote a very hagiographic, a very, pandering sort of life of Constantine. In his Life of Constantine, Eusebius tells of the life, the military campaigns, and finally the conversion of to Christianity of the Emperor Constantine. It's, again, as I say, it was all very dramatic. As Eusebius describes the event, a most marvelous sign appeared to Constantine from heaven, the account of which may have been hard to believe had it been related by any other person. He said that about noon, when the day was already beginning to decline, he saw with his own eyes the trophy of a cross of light in the heavens above the sun, and bearing the inscription, "Conquered by this." So he saw the sign of a cross in heaven, and at this sight he himself was struck with amazement, his whole army also, which followed him on this expedition and witnessed the miracle. So apparently, according to Eusebius in the story that Constantine told, he saw the sign in the sky. It was a cross. They were having these struggles in the empire at the time. Christianity was still an illegal religion, although it was nevertheless growing. And Constantine took this as a sign that he should convert to Christianity and then go on and continue his battles basically under the sign of the cross. During Constantine's reign, several important events for Christianity took place. One was official persecution ended. This was at the Edict of Milan in 313. We've already referenced this, where in the history of Christianity, Constantine is most remembered for bringing state-sanctioned persecution to the end. So he officially ended persecution by the emperors. Only one other emperor who shows up a little bit later, Justinian, called Justinian the Apostate, is still pagan. All the rest of them claim to be Christians of one stripe or another. He moved the capital of the empire to Constantinople. So he moved it from Rome over to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. And that actually was not so radical because, again, remember there were 2 Caesars, there were 2 emperors that were just before him, and they had actually made 2 different capitals, one in Rome and one in Constantinople. So he just moved officially the whole apparatus over to that side of the empire. It was during this time that the Arian controversy raged, and we're going to have a lot to say about that, and that culminated, or at least the first culmination happened at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. And these are all the things we're going to be looking at. The debates of this area, in terms of the Trinitarian controversies, fall into three stages. First, long before Nicaea, long before 325 AD, there was a preliminary stage, and that's the whole ante-Nicene period from the death of John the Apostle to 325 AD, and that's the whole era we have been considering. Then there's the era just before and including Nicaea 325. This is a second stage that focuses on the events and debates that began with the teaching of Arius, and we're going to be talking about that at length. The reaction of Alexander, this is not Alexander the Great, this is Alexander, the bishop now of Alexandria, and his right-hand man, we could say, Athanasius, and the emergence of the first Nicene Creed in 325. That's the first part of this whole debate. Then, after 325 AD, up to Nicaea, another meeting in another council in Nicaea in 381, we have the second phase. The first council of Nicaea didn't really end the debate about the Trinity that it was intended to end. So that whole debate about, we're going to see, about who Christ is and his deity and his relationship to the Father and the nature of the Trinity, that went on for the rest of the 4th century and went on beyond that. But the creed that we have, that we call the Nicene Creed, is the creed that came out modifying the original Nicene Creed of 325, the Nicene Creed of 381. And after Nicaea 381, the post-Nicene period, the debate took a decidedly Christological turn in which the focus was the relationship between the divine and human natures of Christ, and this led to the definition of Chalcedon in 451. So that's a preview. That's all stuff we're going to deal with in detail coming up. We consider here the first stage. This is the part that I want to do in this lecture. Long before the Nicene Council, this stage led up to the discussions about the Trinity. Now here's what we have to note. The men we've already been looking at had some notions of the Trinity. The post-apostolic fathers that we've already seen, they were committed to both monotheism, as we have seen, and the deity of Christ. The problem is they didn't really make any effort. They didn't really feel the need. They just took that on faith. That's what the scriptures were saying, but they didn't really reconcile the two. Essentially, what these post-apostolic fathers did was just repeat the biblical assertions concerning both the Father and the Son, but they didn't really speculate too much on the relationship of the Father and the Son in the Godhead. For them, monotheism was viewed as the dividing line between the church and paganism. And Christ's pre-existence was affirmed, but not explained. And there are occasional hints of what might be called binitarianism, not Trinitarianism, but binitarianism, in which the pre-incarnate Christ is identified with the Holy Spirit. And you can see that in some of those apostolic fathers that we looked at already. Then there were the apologists, and you see the names of those that we've already looked at and some others there. The principal contribution of the apologists was the doctrine of the Logos Christology, and again, we've discussed that. Justin Martyr proposed that the pre-existent Christ was the reason or intelligence of God, so in a sense, the Son was derived from the Father without in all diminishing the latter. But what that meant, again, was not very well articulated. Whereas the apologists did not conceive of God as the Trinity of persons, they didn't have that language yet. Indeed, the Word was not truly personally the Son until he was put forth from the Father for the purpose of creation. They did affirm an eternal and essential union of God and the Logos. So from our standpoint, we look back on that and say they appear to be somewhat confused. One author says, when Justin spoke of the Logos as the second God, worshipped in a secondary rank, and when all the apologists stressed that his generation or emission resulted from an act of the Father's will, their objective wasn't so much to subordinate him as to safeguard the monotheism that they considered indispensable. So there it was. They knew that there was one God, and they knew that somehow the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, Jesus Christ, was related to him, but they wanted to make sure that in no way was God the Father diminished by an acknowledgement that there is God the Son. Tertullian, for instance, we've already seen, conceived of God from two perspectives. First, as in himself, and we would call this the ontological or eminent Trinity today, intrinsically without regard or relation to anything external to himself. But secondly, as he is in relation to the world, we would call this the economic Trinity today, through the divine activities of creation. This distinction, here's the fine print there, is between the ontological or eminent Trinity, that is God as he is in eternal relations, and the economic Trinity, that is God in relation to his creation, is a later development. But in part, this comes from these theologians. Again, not that they articulated it that clearly, but what they talked about or what they seemed to indicate they believed at the time is something along these lines. Tertullian, again, with respect to the former, that is, God as he is in himself, contains within himself his word or reason or wisdom. And as to the latter, as he is in relation to the world, his word and wisdom manifest themselves respectively as Son and Spirit. That is, these theologians thought that the personal relationships of Father, Son, and Spirit do not exist. That's wrong. Until the manifestation of God in creation and redemption. That doesn't really make any sense, but you can see what they were trying to say. So they recognize that if you read the scriptures, it's clear that there is a distinction between the Father and the Son and the Spirit, but again, they really didn't work it out how that developed. So again, still thinking of Tertullian's work, he thought that God is properly the Father and Christ is properly the Son, but not, here it comes, and here's where he's wrong, the eternal being of God. But that this is a relationship that's manifested in the economy of God's redemptive purpose on earth. In other words, the distinct persons of the Godhead only came to be in the time and space realm of creation. Now that's wrong. But to his credit, Tertullian was the first to speak of the Godhead as a Trinity, as we've already seen, and didn't hesitate to describe both the Son and the Spirit as persons. But again, he didn't really put it together the right way. He saw these as characteristics of God only in the temporal economy, in the outworking of redemption, not in the eternal being of God. And again, that just let the door open to a number of problems. Then you have the contribution of Origen, which we've already said in the last lecture was sort of mixed. Origen affirmed an eternal trinity of persons in the Godhead, but to avoid tritheism, or three gods, he insisted that the Father was the fountainhead of deity, from whom the Son was in some sense derived. Now, if you're following me a little bit here, you might say, well, that sounds a little bit Platonic from what we've seen in terms of a higher realm emanating a next realm or the lower realm. And that the thinking is right. The doctrine would be somewhat different. But the Son, argued Origen, is a secondary God. He even refers to him as deuteros theos. And that's wrong. The Son is God, but not in and of himself. He is in God by participation and derivation from the foundational deity of the Father. And again, that's wrong and really doesn't make any sense. So, and we've already alluded to this, Origen introduced the strong note of subordination of the second and third persons of the Trinity. That is, the subordination means that the second person, the Son, and the third person of the Trinity, the Spirit, were subordinate. They were under the authority, power, or even being of God the Father. In spite of this subordination, as we've already seen, Origen articulated the concept of the eternal generation of the Son, and that is scriptural. So the legacy here is that these men, before this big debate of the 4th century, they got some things right and some things wrong. And when you see people getting some things right and some things wrong, that just opens up the door to a big controversy. So we can see that the post-apostolic fathers, the apologists, Tertullian, Origen, and the early church held firmly to the truth there's one God, Deuteronomy 6:4, and that they also saw that Scripture revealed that in some sense the Son is God, Jesus Christ is also God, and this is again exactly what we will have to consider when we look at a few heresies later on. These certain heresies that came later on were monarchianism, also known as Sabellianism, after one of their leaders, and they had a view that said that there's one God and he just shows up in three different ways. Dynamic monarchianism, again, another early heresy, adoptionism, and modalistic monarchy. We're going to consider all these heresies later, so you don't have to get them down right now. Again, don't forget that this is just a preview of what's to come. The reason for these differing explanations, again, may be found in specific biblical texts that the various theologians appeal to. Jaroslav Pelikan, a very prominent church historian, has identified four classes of these texts that bore considerable influence on the early church. Texts that seem to speak of adoption. I'm not going to read all of this. You can read it. Texts that seem to identify either a predicate of deity of the Son, that either saying that he's God, or applied text to him and titles that would otherwise be true only of Yahweh or the Lord in the Old Testament. There were texts that appear to affirm a distinction between the Father and the Son, Proverbs 8 in particular, and then text of derivation, which, by referring to the Father as the greater or using some titles like angel, spirit, logos, or son, suggested that he came from God and was somehow less than God. So this is what these early church fathers had been struggling with. They looked at the scriptures, they carefully considered them, but they didn't have the hindsight of what we have. What we're going to be seeing is the Nicene Creed and some of the work that the early church worked out. But it's our job to sort of, in this class, see how they worked that out. In any case, what really lies behind a lot of this is a commitment of the deity of Christ. So the thing that made orthodoxy come out on top in the end, we're going to see, is that when they read the scriptures, there was no question that the scriptures taught that Jesus Christ was God, along with the Father and the Spirit. And so I would encourage you to watch this more than once and read over the PowerPoints there most carefully so that we can move into the next phase of this class in historical theology, which is a very critical phase, the Trinitarian debates of the 4th century.